Does God sleep? Well, every Christian and Jewish theologian will probably tell you, well, no, of course not. But would the writers of the Bible agree with modern theologians? Well, when we look at the Bible, it's not clear that they would. Psalm 121 says that God watches over Israel, and he doesn't slumber or sleep. But when you read Psalm 44, the psalmist calls out for God to wake up. They ask God, why do you sleep? So, what do we make of this? Does God sleep or not? Do we just have the book of Psalms mixing metaphors, or is there more going on behind the question of whether God sleeps? Today we're going to look at a concept called divine rest. We'll see how it was understood in the wider Near Eastern world, how the biblical authors pick up on it, and what implications it may have for our theological deliberations today.
Many people have wrestled with the idea of divine rest. The historical consensus in Christian theology is that God doesn't sleep, and this consensus is so broad that the question hardly ever comes up. At the same time, we also clearly see instances in the Bible where God is depicted as sleeping or resting. For example, the phrase arise, which is a frequent refrain in the Psalms, seems to be a call for God to awaken and arise out of bed. Some have interpreted this to be a call for God to get on God's throne and render judgment, but this just creates other issues. And others say this is just a metaphor for God's apparent inattentiveness, but this also runs afoul of Orthodox teaching and would need further explanation. But now, the biblical scholar Bernard Batto has looked at this through the lens of Near Eastern literature and the motif of the sleeping God. He has some excellent insights that avoid some of these sticky theological problems. Batto proposes the idea that the sleeping God motif includes two related concepts. First, in the ancient Near East, rest was a divine prerogative. Second, sleeping is a mark of divine rule. There are some issues with this model, but despite those issues, it has a lot going for it. So we're going to present this interpretation as Batto does. First is the idea that gods can rest, and it is their right or privilege to do so. This is clear from numerous Near Eastern texts. In the Memphite theology from Egypt, the priests of Ptah rewrote the primeval history of the world and wrote a theology in which their local god Ptah was the creator god. And after Ptah puts the world in order, it says, and so Ptah rested after he had made everything, as well as all the divine order. In other parts of the ancient world, it's not just the creator god who deserves rest, but the minor ones as well. In the stories of Atrahasis and the Enuma Elish, we see the gods expecting to be able to rest. Atrahasis begins with this expectation. It's clear that the gods do not want to or expect to toil, and something is wrong because they have to work. The Igigi, or the lesser gods, were forced to work for the Anunnaki, or the great gods. This is also a problem because even though the Igigi were lesser gods, they were still divine and thus should be allowed to rest. As the story unfolds, the Igigi rebel, a justified response to their forced toil, and their leader is killed. Humans are formed from his blood, and humans then assume the responsibility of working for the gods. This idea that humans were created to labor for the gods is echoed in the Enuma Elish when Marduk fashions humans from the blood of a god named Kingu. He did this so humans bear the toil of the gods so that they may rest. Batto goes on to demonstrate that because the gods deserve to rest, sleep is a mark of their sovereignty. The chief god could sleep when the world was rightly ordered, and to disturb that sleep is a kind of rebellion, the disruption of their divinely ordained order. Back in the Atrahasis epic, the lesser gods stage their revolt at night, while the chief gods sleep. This is also behind the story of the flood in Atrahasis. The gods are disturbed and send the flood because they cannot rest. And this is often seen as a petty reason to wipe out humanity, but in light of Batto's model, we can see that the noise coming from humans is not just noise, but a disruption of cosmic order. The disruption of sleep is not a problem because the gods are lazy and want to sleep. It's because rest is their divine prerogative, and they're angry, like parents getting woken up by their kids early every morning. Every single morning. Instead, we see this noise and disruption as a challenge of the gods' authority as divine rulers. Instead of letting the gods rest, as was their prerogative, humans grew noisy and violated their purpose in creation, to labor for the gods. Again, this is echoed in the Enuma Elish when the younger gods rebel against Tiamat and her consort Apsu. Tiamat initially wants mercy for them, but she eventually relents and tells her husband to put down their rebellion so he can rest by day and sleep by night. Later in the story, the god Marduk destroys Tiamat and creates the world from her carcass. He surveys his work and then he rests, taking up his divine prerogative now that the world is ordered. He hangs up his bow as his work is done. He's able to rest in his palace as king of the gods. We can see from all these examples that rest is an important symbol for divine authority. The gods put the world in order so that they can rest, and that rest is a mark of their legitimacy as king over the gods.
The most obvious example of divine rest in the Bible is in Genesis 2 verses 1 through 3, where on the seventh day of creation, God rested from all his work. Now this has a number of parallels in ancient Near Eastern literature. In the Mesopotamian literature, the king of the gods rests in their palace upon the completion of their creating work. In the Baal cycle, after his conflict with the rival god Yam, Baal wants to build a palace for himself as king of the gods. Now it's easy to see this theme behind Genesis 2. God orders the world in Genesis 1, and once it's ordered, God rests, not in a palace, but in the creation itself. Furthermore, God rests as the unchallenged sovereign over all of creation. Elsewhere in the Bible, we see God's appropriate resting place is in the temple. The book of Chronicles says as much. And the Psalms are even more explicit about this idea. The connection between rest and ordering the world is also made in the Bible outside of Genesis 2. Isaiah 51 is a prime example of this, as it uses these themes of creation and rest. This passage is set as a kind of back and forth between Israel and God. In verses 9 through 11, the prophet calls on God to awake as in days of old, which is a euphemism for the days of creation. It recounts how God defeated the sea dragons and chaos monsters and conquered the watery chaos. We see here an explicit link between the themes of creation and ordering the world and God resting. Now, the idea of conquest over chaotic forces and a victorious God resting in his palace provide the rhetorical force behind Isaiah 51. The Israelites are seeing chaos all around them, so they appeal to God to wake up and once again bring order as he did at creation. But God responds that it is not God who is asleep, but the Israelites. Now, God has never not been in control. God's rest does not correlate to an absence or a lack of care for the world. Rather, God is resting yet attentive, and it is God's people who need to be awakened from the slumber of their disobedience. Now, yet there are other places in the Bible where we see explicit references to God sleeping. When we see God sleeping in the Psalms, things are not good. These are all psalms of lament. They claim that God was asleep when the world was in chaos. God was thought to be asleep when his authority and sovereignty were challenged. Israel implores him to awaken as he did at creation and set the world back in order. Asking God to wake up is an affirmation that he is sovereign and the ruler of all, even in the midst of evil and injustice. Now, while the idea of divine rest appears in numerous places in the Old Testament, it also makes a surprising appearance in the New Testament. In Matthew 8 and Mark 4, we find the episode of Jesus and his disciples crossing the Sea of Galilee in a boat. A huge storm blows in, and the disciples are afraid that their boat will capsize and they'll drown. But where is Jesus? Sleeping in the bottom of the boat. Yet when his disciples call on him, Jesus gets up, speaks, and calms the water. Now, this is a clear echo of the ordering of creation in Genesis 1 that is meant to demonstrate the divinity of Jesus to the reader. Just as God spoke to bring creation into order out of the watery chaos, so Jesus speaks to demonstrate his authority over the storm and restore order and safety to the world of those who follow him. Finally, in the Bible, we find a unique idea that divine rest is available to human beings as well. In Psalm 95, God declares that because of the disobedience of the generation of Israelites who refused to enter the promised land, God swore an oath, "They shall never enter my rest." Rather than being set apart for toil for God forever, the calling of Israel was instead to enter into the divine rest with God in the land God had promised to them. Yet they refused. The author of Hebrews picks up this idea in chapters 3 and 4 to describe eternal life with God as a Sabbath rest for God's people. Hebrews tells us that the divine rest of God is available to all who place their faith in Jesus. Rather than a life of laboring for salvation, God invites all people to enter God's rest and find rest for their souls from the toil of the world. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you want to learn more about this topic, we've included some references and resources in the description below. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like it, be sure to subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Beneath the Bible. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.